In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Some part of me didn't want to believe the news, but deep inside I was waiting for it. Over the past year, I had heard many times from Russian officers that luck in the war was now on their side. I was sure that the information that reached them was carefully filtered to boost morale in their ranks, but the sight of battered German soldiers streaming into the camp told a different story. On May 9, at 6 o'clock in the early morning, the camp commander lined up all the camp inhabitants and made an announcement. All prisoners of war were given the uplifting message that all would eventually be liberated. This formation greatly encouraged all of us. The chief informed us that the Poles would be the first to be liberated. I wondered whether I would be part of this group, because the Poles often said about me that I was not a Pole at all, but a German. Even the German officers began to doubt whether I was really a Pole. As before, nothing was said about the time of our liberation, but the very realization of it lifted the spirits of all of us, both among the prisoners of war and the guards. Several weeks passed, but no new announcements were made. And then on July 1, the NKVD camps received an order to release some of the Poles. This news spread to all corners of the camp. All Poles were ordered to gather at noon at the main administrative building. Shortly before the appointed hour, I found Bruno, and the rest of the way we traveled together without saying a word. Both of us were in high spirits, although we had every reason to be nervous. At exactly 12 o'clock, an NKVD officer came out of the building and addressed the audience with a speech. After a brief introduction, which I could not hear very well, he began to read out the names of those who were to be released first. I waited restlessly until I heard my name called out. I was immediately overcome with a feeling of relief. I almost fainted. It was as if a heavy weight had fallen from my shoulders. A little later, I heard Bruno's name. I turned to him with a smile. For a while he stood staring at the officer who had just given him the best news of his life. Then his emotions overwhelmed him and he cried. He turned to me and smiled too, then held out his arms to me. We did this. After the last names on the list were read out, the crowd began to disperse. A German colonel came up to me and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Get out one station before Warsaw. Don't stay near the rest of the Polish soldiers. Soldiers like you can only be found in the German army." My heart stopped beating for a second as I looked into his eyes. There must have been a look of extreme surprise on my face, but he only smiled in response, then turned and walked away. For a minute I pondered what had happened, but then I decided that I shouldn't bother. I didn't want to think about anything that would keep me from enjoying the happy moment. It was time to quietly celebrate the event to myself. On July 13, Bruno and I, along with several dozen Polish prisoners of war, stood waiting at the camp gate. The mood was joyful. Everyone was joking with each other. The sentries remained serious. They were waiting for the order to open the gates. When the command came, the gates opened and everyone rushed out. For the first time, Bruno and I stepped out of the camp together, unaccompanied by guards and without guns pointed at us. It was truly the happiest day of my life. We walked with the whole crowd down the muddy road to the train station in Stalino. We looked like a miserable crowd, but nobody cared. No one carried any belongings, as we simply didn't have any. We must have been an interesting sight when we entered the city and walked through its streets to the station. We caught a lot of unkind looks, and a hail of swearing was hurled at us, but we paid no attention to it. We did not even look back. At the station, the Russian guards were already waiting for us. They ordered us to wait another day until we could board a train that would take us to Warsaw. We spent the night on the ground outside. The night air was warm and gentle. We were given small portions of bread and water to keep up our strength. The next morning, our train arrived. Then followed 9 days of traveling westward. We stopped in Poznan, where we were unloaded from the train and taken to another Russian camp for inspection. The Russian authorities questioned each of us and made sure our papers were in order. Here Bruno and I parted ways. He and I hugged goodbye, then he turned and disappeared. I never saw him again. I tried to stay calm, and it was very comforting to think that soon I would have a chance to disappear just like that and end this sad chapter in my life. I stayed in that camp for a few more days. The conditions there were not much better than in the previous 2 camps, but at least here I was not forced to work. On August 1, I received my papers authorizing me to continue my journey. When they handed them to me, I stared at the papers for a long time and could not believe that all this was really happening. My name, surname, and home address in Katowice were listed there. Yes, it was really happening to me. The head of the Russian echelon wished to preserve order among the excited crowd of former prisoners of war, so we were forced to march in column one at a time from the camp to the main railroad station in Poznan. We were all happy and in a hurry to get on the train. At 10 p.m., we left Poznan on the evening train for Katowice. We arrived at our destination at 2 p.m. the next day. I was still wearing the German cap and uniform issued to me for the propaganda event in Kiev, but I also had a black Russian fur coat which I wore over my uniform. I got off the train, walked about 500 meters from the station, and looked around. I was very nervous as the moment of truth had arrived for me. At the station, we were met by a group of Polish soldiers. They had been ordered to take the prisoners of war to another camp in Katowice for another check. There was no way to check us all in Poznan because it was a very busy railroad junction through which thousands of former prisoners of war bound for Danzig and Upper Silesia passed. Many civilians waited at the station for trains to arrive, expecting to meet their loved ones. There were shouts of joy, people hugging each other, telling stories of what had happened to them while they were apart. Many of the former prisoners got off the train and ran away to avoid the crowds of people who came out to greet the trains. I wanted no part of it. With my head down and wrapped tightly in my black fur coat, I glided past the Polish soldiers waiting to check us in. I hurried along the railroad tracks to get out of there as quickly as possible. I couldn't risk revealing that I had never served in the Polish army. I walked through Katowice in the direction of the nearby town of Zabrze, where I was born. On the way, I passed many people in the streets, but I tried not to meet their eyes. Nevertheless, my attention was attracted by one woman who was walking towards me in the opposite direction. She was my age, and as we got closer, she looked at me with a long, hard stare. I smiled back at her. She must have noticed the military uniform I was wearing, but I don't think she was able to see it properly and determine if it was German. The woman stopped in front of me and handed me 10 zlotys. "Take it. You must be hungry," she said. It was a valuable gift as I had no money at all. I thanked her and continued down the main street through Zabrze towards the police station. I knew many of the people who worked here and hoped to find some friendly sympathy. As I got closer, I attracted the attention of the sentry outside. "Hey you!" he shouted. "Come here. Hurry up." I hesitated briefly, then walked in his direction, trying to look as calm and trustworthy as possible. But inside I was panic-stricken. I thought to myself that coming here had been a mistake on my part. This was the end of my game. Now I would be uncovered and sent back to the Russian POW camp. I entrusted my fate to God, asking him to guide me to the right path. As I came closer, the sentry ordered again, "Come up and follow me." Without saying anything, I followed him into the police station, walked down the corridor to a room where some officer was sitting at a table. "Have a seat," he invited me. I sat down on a chair on the other side of the table and waited for my fate to be decided. The officer at the table looked at me carefully and asked me in a harsh tone, "Do you speak Polish?" I answered almost arrogantly, "Of course. Since I am a Polish citizen, of course I must be able to speak Polish, among other things. May I see your papers?" I reached into my pocket, worrying that the German uniform I was wearing would not be visible, and handed him the documents I had been given before I was released from the camp. The man at the desk looked at the documents for quite a while. After a few minutes, it became evident that he was dissatisfied with something. Rising from the table, he threw me, "Wait here." The officer went out into the corridor and spoke to the sentry who had brought me and was now waiting outside the door to the office. The two men spoke in muffled voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they seemed intent on throwing me in jail again. I decided that this was the moment to try to get them to sympathize with my situation. "Excuse me, gentlemen," I said loudly to get their attention. "I am a Polish officer. I am returning from Russia, where I spent 2 years in a prison camp. I was released by the NKVD, that is, the Russians officially released me. I am tired. I'm dirty. I haven't seen proper food for months. I haven't seen my family for years, who probably think I'm not alive. I just want to go home. Please help me." The officer from behind the desk looked up at me again and spoke. "Right away, soldier." I was immediately given my release papers back. Then he called the first Polish corporal in sight. "Escort this man to the bus," he commanded, "and don't ask him any questions. We want him back with his family as soon as possible." "Thank you very much." I thanked them both in the most heartfelt tone of voice. The corporal and I walked out of the building and down the street. We waited in silent anticipation for a few minutes until the bus pulled up. When the driver opened the door, the corporal told the conductor that I didn't have to pay the fare. He nodded in agreement. I thanked both men and got on the bus. There was still a ray of hope in me for a happy homecoming. As I sat on the bench on the bus, I began to worry about my German uniform. It bothered me more and more. I pondered whether I would be able to exchange my uniform for civilian clothes. Then I remembered a cousin who lived near the town of Katowice. After 5 more stops on the bus, I got off and headed across the fields toward Katowice. By this point, it was getting quite dark. This was going to be a long day for me. I laid down in a wheat field to sleep and wait out the night. The next morning, I went on through the fields and walked like that until I reached Katowice. I crept through the streets silently and cautiously, fearing to speak to anyone. When at last I reached my cousin's house, I tried to look around the house from all sides so that no one could see me enter. Knocking on the door, I began to wait impatiently. I was lucky and the door was opened by her herself. At first, my cousin didn't recognize me, and there was nothing surprising about that. I had lost a lot of weight in the last year or two. I was unshaven and very dirty. I told my cousin that I hoped for her immediate help, as I was in trouble and needed clothes. A warm smile appeared on her face. Taking my hand, she led me into the house and then quickly slammed the door behind us. She told me I needed to rest, wash, and shave first, and that I could go on my way tomorrow. She would get me everything I needed. I obeyed gladly, and soon I felt human again. I was extremely grateful to my relative for her hospitality. Early the next morning, I was on the road again, and my adventures continued. I left Katowice by bus, paying my fare with a few coins from the money I had received from my relative. My route lay through Hindenburg to Gliwice. I had to avoid the city center because I suspected that I would certainly be stopped and interrogated there. As soon as I got off the bus, a policeman immediately appeared right in front of me. I had to rely again on the fact that God would not forsake me. It looked as if I had fallen into a trap before I got here, but the policeman paid no attention to me, and the bus rumbled safely away. Tilting my head, I quickly made my way down the side streets through my hometown. Along the way, I noticed many things, such as unfamiliar Russian and Polish faces, and buildings that had been damaged by German artillery fire. I had seen many traces of war before, from the unpleasant to the downright horrible, but now that I had to witness the glories of destruction and occupation in my native place, I was especially uncomfortable. I walked a little farther, and there it was, my native home. But even these familiar places were not without war marks. Right on the wall was an inscription that read, "Nothing to rob here." I touched the front door, but it was closed. I just glanced through the window into the room behind it, so no one would think I was trying to sneak in. It seemed to me that no one was home. I was suddenly overcome with a feeling of uneasiness. I walked away from the house and went to the center of town where my relatives lived. Soon I saw my sister-in-law in front of their house. I tried to tilt my head lower so that she wouldn't see me, but it was too late. She was looking in my direction. My sister-in-law ran toward me, unable to stop shouting, "This can't be happening." She knew that I had been missing in action in 1943 and thought I was dead. Before she threw herself into my arms, I put a finger in my mouth to make her stop. "We don't need to be seen. Do you understand?" My family was fine. They were in the house. Taking my hand, she led me down the road I had just traveled back to my house. The front door was boarded up so looters couldn't get into the house through it, so we walked around the house and headed to the back door. Then she knocked gently. Through the window, I looked into the house and saw my son's face as he headed toward the door to open it. That's when I finally felt like I was really home. My son didn't recognize me through the window. I thought it was because I was wearing the polished military uniform my cousin had given me. Following my son was my wife. Unsuspecting, she opened the door and looked at me. Instantly, the expression on her face changed to one of amazement. Blood rushed from her face and my wife began to settle to the floor. I quickly put my arms around her and pulled her to me. "It's okay," I said. "Everything will be all right. I'm here now." I clearly realized that even though the war was over, there were many trials ahead of us. I was so happy and comfortable lying in my own bed with my wife, even though the sounds of war were still there. At night, I heard several times the cries for help of women who were being raped by the Poles who had settled in the neighborhood. I wanted so much for my torture to finally end, for these cries to stop, but there was nothing I could do. The streets were not safe, at least not for the Germans living there. For me, the war was not over, it had just entered a new phase. I hadn't registered with the police yet, as I wasn't sure if I should stay here. One of my uncles lived next door, and I thought that maybe he could explain to me what was going on and advise me how to proceed. In the morning, I went to his house. When my aunt opened the door to me, she was amazed because she did not expect to see me. She quickly took me inside. My uncle was not at home. The news was not good. My aunt told me that anyone who admitted to being an ex-soldier but had no papers would be sent to jail immediately. She also made me realize that my uncle could not help me in any way, even if I had documents from the Russian camp and from the Polish authorities. When she told me all this, I stood still for a moment to consider what I should do now. It was clear to me that I should not go to the police again. Years ago, I had helped my uncle with the problem, and I thought he would want to thank me for it. The fact that there was nothing he could do meant that I was in a very bad position. Looking up at my aunt, I said that I could always turn to God for help. My aunt was clearly uncomfortable with my presence in her house, so I decided to leave as soon as possible. I walked quickly through the streets back to my home. I explained to my family that we would not be able to stay here. I felt that the best place for us would be at my parents' house. I gathered the belongings my son had stored under the floorboards. Together we packed as much as we could carry and walked to the railroad station. As we left the house, I looked back one last time, wondering if I would ever see my home again. I was sad to leave it. I had to experience so much hardship just to survive, just to come back here. And after only one day, I had to leave it behind. We boarded a train that was heading west across the Oder toward the Czechoslovakian border. On the train, I spoke Russian to all the Poles who addressed me, and I told my family not to speak a word at all. There were two Russian officers on the train. I wanted the Poles, thinking I was one of those Russians too, to leave me alone. It worked. We reached my parents' house late in the afternoon. They lived in a spacious villa on the edge of the forest, very close to the Czech border, which ran along the hill above the town. When they opened the door, both of them were shocked to see us, as they knew I was missing. Back at the house, we told each other our stories again. I was saddened to learn that here I could not register at the police station. We were all supposed to stay out of sight and away from the authorities until the danger had passed, and we didn't know how long that would last. Security became a big problem for us, but soon another one came on top of it. After the war, food became a great scarcity, and we had little means of obtaining it. I could not openly go into town and buy anything there. Besides, it was almost impossible for me to get a job to support our large, sprawling family. It now became a lot of mouths that needed to be fed. I had to start looking for food. Every morning I would get up very early and go to the forest for mushrooms. At night, I would go to the fields from where I would bring back potatoes, cabbage, and kohlrabi cabbage that I had stolen there. I felt no shame. I was doing what I had to do to survive. I needed to bring enough food into the house to feed 7 people. A few days after we moved into my parents' house, I prepared a special surprise for them. I came home with a calf carcass that I had purchased from the mayor of the town for 180 zlotys. Everyone was happy about it, except my parents. They were very worried at the thought of what I could be in danger of staying there at the market. The mayor thought I was Russian, so he sold me the meat without question. I thought I could pass myself off as Russian, especially since I still shaved my head. It worked. We cooked the meat in just half an hour, and when it was ready, we had a real feast. I hadn't eaten like that in a long time, and now I could remember again how good it felt to have a full stomach. One day, when I wasn't home, my parents did something that made me quite anxious. They made friends with someone new in the neighborhood, a community worker who had moved into a house not far from my parents' house, somewhat closer to downtown. This man offered to let my parents keep some of their prized possessions. I don't know what he told my parents, but he managed to instill confidence in them. They had already lost their land and house, and now they were afraid that a little time would pass and the communists would come for the rest of their property. They were probably right, but I didn't know the man well enough to know if he was trustworthy. My mother and father gathered the jewelry and some other personal belongings into a sturdy box that they locked up. They encouraged me to do the same, and I reluctantly agreed. They were very excited to meet the man as he had made a very good impression on them. How I wish I could have shared their enthusiasm. That evening, I accompanied my parents home where their new acquaintance agreed to meet us. After we handed him the boxes, I tried to hurry back home, but he persuaded us to stay and struck up a conversation with my parents. I tried to say as little as possible. At one point, the conversation turned to the fact that the man offered my parents to exchange the food he was getting from Poland for what they were willing to sell him. This offer made me suspicious, and now I felt even less comfortable in his company. The next day that worker showed up at the house too, he said, check how they were doing, as he was worried. I wasn't home at the time. I was in the woods. Somehow, the new acquaintance convinced my parents to come to his house again in the evening to show me what he had stored for them in the box. I couldn't convince my mother that this was a bad idea, and that evening, with great reluctance, my brother and I again accompanied my parents to his house, where they were to open the box and show him its contents. When we got to his house, he sat us down at the table in the kitchen while he ducked down into the basement to get the box. Soon he came out again and set the box on the table. Then he looked up, scrutinized each of us, and asked me who I was. I didn't want to answer, but my mother explained that I was her son. He looked at me with a strange look. Then he took out a cigarette case and offered a cigarette each to my father and brother, but closed the case in front of my nose without offering me a smoke. I realized I had received a message. My mother opened the box and explained what was inside. She was eager to address the details and proudly told the story of some of the items. Our interlocutor tried very hard to show interest in the conversation, but spoke very little himself. He was looking intently at the box and its contents, as if he were mentally trying to memorize it. When the conversation was over, he thanked us and signaled that we should go now. The next day, even before sunrise, I was up and out for a full day in the woods. The places I usually holed up in were becoming less and less abundant. I was finding it increasingly difficult to find food by exploring the woods or raiding the fields at night. It was clear that this could not last. I needed to get money to provide food on my family's table. The next morning, I waited for daylight and went to the neighboring village of Katowice in search of work. I walked into one of the farms on the outskirts of the township. Near the house, some old man was repairing a door. I approached him and asked him if he had any work for me. The old man's name was Drashner. I was very glad when he agreed to hire me to help him on the farm. It helped my family a lot. While I was trying to earn some money by working on the farm, my mother started selling some of our belongings to a laborer to whom she and my father had entrusted their possessions for safekeeping. This, too, helped put food on the family table, but as time went on, she received less and less in exchange. I guess the reason only when the only thing that man gave us for some of the jewelry was half a kilo of salt. Mother realized that she had no choice but to take what he offered us. After all, we had few sources of obtaining food. My work on the farm made me more confident during the day, so I spent less and less time in the woods and more time devoted to chores when I wasn't needed on the farm. One day around 11 a.m., I was chopping wood in my parents' front yard when something suddenly caught my eye. I looked toward town and saw that laborer come out of his house. After another hour, I saw him walking back, but not alone. There were 3 soldiers following him, and they were all heading towards our house. I rushed inside to warn my parents. I realized that I should have taken everything that was packed and ready to go out of the house outside, but it was too late. The only thing I had time for was to warn everyone and rush away into the woods to hide myself. My family huddled together inside. hoping that this confrontation with the authorities wouldn't result in them being kicked out of their home. Without knocking on the door, the soldiers entered the house along with the gentleman my parents trusted so much. He now followed the soldiers. My mother begged them to leave our family alone, but the soldiers paid no attention to what she said. While two of them searched the house, the third ordered my mother to tell them where she was hiding her belongings to be confiscated by the state. The mother was too upset to answer, so the soldiers continued to turn everything in the house upside down. They knocked all the walls and floor looking for valuables and weapons. They soon found most of what we had managed to pack and immediately confiscated it all. They'd also took some other things they thought were of some value, including what my wife's son and I had brought with us. They left, laden with trophies, but it seemed to me that they were not satisfied with that. I watched them carefully from a safe distance, sheltered in the woods, waiting for them to move far enough away from the house for me to return there. I had a hunch they were still coming. I needed to make sure my personal belongings didn't get to the communists. The next day, I went to the house of a public worker and demanded that he return them to me. To my surprise, he obeyed, though he did so with a look on his face as if he was sure and wanted to demonstrate to me that he would someday get it all back. I took the things to the farm in Katowice, where I hoped they would be perfectly safe. I was grateful to the farmer for allowing me to stash my belongings there. I decided not to stay there and not to return to work for at least a few days. I realized that it would be dangerous for me to be seen here, at least right now. I didn't want to endanger the farmer himself for contacting me, but my options were limited and we were all left without food. Events like this began to happen with increasing frequency. The authorities continued to search houses in the town, even at night. Luckily for me, the weather was good, which gave me the opportunity to spend the night in the woods. One afternoon, as I expected, the police came to my parents' house again. I realized that they were not satisfied with what they had found at our house the first time. This time, they acted more thoroughly. The police again searched the house thoroughly, overturning furniture and poking holes in the walls as if they were looking for something valuable. They were trying to find and capture me, an undocumented civilian who could pose a threat to the authorities. They demanded to know where I was, but my family continued to deny that anyone else was living in the house. The situation escalated when one of the police officers pulled out a gun and pointed it at my mother and father. He stated to them, "If the remains of your property and your absconding son are not found by 9 p.m., you know what will happen to you." After that, the policeman left our house. My son ran to look for me in the forest and told me the news. I realized that I had to act immediately. We had to escape immediately. I confided in one of the sheikhs I knew who lived near the border, very close to my parents' house in Badkoto. I gathered the people dear to me, my parents, my wife, my son, my brother, my two sisters, and my 4-year-old nephew. We took very few things with us, some clothes, a few pots to cook food, and the money we still had. We left our parents' house on the hill and rushed into the forests. We reached a place from where it was about 500 meters to the border and took shelter there. I instructed everyone to lie quietly and not say a word while I went on to make sure that the rest of the way to the border crossing was free. It was. I returned and reported that the way was open. Then we all rushed into Czechoslovakian territory. We went on through the woods to the house of a Czech man I knew. He lived with his wife, who was German. This man was happy to help and offered us a small room in his house where my family could stay for a while. I knew he had done similar things many times before. I left my family at his house, and that night I went to Katowice to pick up my belongings. My relatives were very afraid for me and could not rest until I came back. I arrived safely back the same evening. We all gathered together in the same small room to decide how we would proceed. We realized that we couldn't feel safe here either. Border patrols often drop by here, and they also search the area thoroughly. I had to make a new decision. The next morning, I went back to the town of Bad Kudoa to see what had become of my parents' house. As I got closer to the house, remaining invisible in the forest, I noticed some movement in the house from a safe distance. I saw soldiers in and around the house. They were Poles who were obviously looking for us. I stood like that and watched the house for a while, and then went back to the house on the border. 10 days had passed. We knew it was time to leave. If we stayed here any longer, we risked being caught. I decided that the best way for us would be to leave for Germany, but first we had to move out of this house. I needed some time to prepare for the journey. All of us, 9 of us, traveled back into Poland looking for a new place to hide. The first stop we made was at a farmer's house in Jersey, Katowice. I asked the farmer Drashner for permission for my wife and son to live on the farm for a few days. He was an understanding man and gladly helped us. Then I took my parents and other relatives back to Bad Kudowa, where they were able to stay with their friends. We did everything we could to thank them. On October 5, the Polish government announced that all Germans living in Poland who wished to return to Germany were allowed to register to be sent there. My parents and relatives took advantage of this opportunity and signed up to be relocated. It wasn't going to happen right away, but I was glad that they would soon be rid of all the problems here. I, on the other hand, was not so lucky. As a former soldier in the German army, I was afraid of what might happen to me if I went to the Polish authorities. Therefore, my family and I continued to hide in Jersey, Katowice. My wife and son moved to another house there in Jersey, Katowice, with an acquaintance of mine who was kind enough to agree to help us. I stayed on the farm to earn at least some money. Besides, I felt it would be safer for them to live apart from me. After the war, famine was rampant throughout Poland. Food shortages were rampant. Those Polish citizens who registered received cards that provided a basic set of staples, but even that was not enough to feed their families. Those who did not register could also apply for food, but they were forced to work for the Polish government for 2 days for free, and only then did they receive anything, often just a piece of bread. As for our family, we looked well, but we were completely deprived of strength. We ate 3 potato cakes during the day and liquid soup with flour in the evening, but no meat or fat or any other protein. Soon our supplies were quite exhausted. Again, we had to look for some way out. After weighing the pros and cons, I decided to go to Brno in the Sudetes. There I would try to find support from my uncle who lived there. He was a figure in the anti-fascist movement. I hoped that we would be able to pass through Czechoslovakia and from there into the American-controlled zone. I wanted to consult with him and see if we could count on that. My 17-year-old son asked me to take him along, and I was glad to have his company. Our route took us through the town of Ladne to the town of Stern. I did not know the area, so we had to consult a map we had found. We passed the main church in Stern and determined the direction we should take to get to Brno. We found the right road. I noticed fresh shoe prints and dog tracks on the road. We had to be careful not to get caught by the border patrol, so we climbed up the rocky hill above the road and continued on parallel to it. Hiking across the border became a very risky venture. If you were caught by a border patrol, they would take away all your possessions and put you in jail for 10 hours. It was also said that the guards there beat detainees. It was said that women get 50 lashes and men 100. After that, you could be free. But the hunger was so strong that despite the danger, many still went along with it all. Some of those who crossed the border managed to get to Glatz, but those who were caught were treated horribly. One of our acquaintances, who had returned from prison, told stories of how Germans caught there had their fingers broken. Prisoners were forced to insert their fingers into a doorway, and then these thugs would close the door, mutilating the fingers. I felt that I had no other choice, so despite the warnings, I went to the border. Down the road, I went to the town of Zarek, where I hoped to buy a card with which I could get groceries. Then I planned to walk the 10 kilometers to Nakod and buy some things. I headed for the border at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I needed to get there by midnight, the time when the border patrols change. The border crossing went safely. I reached the town of Zarek without incident, but there I found out that I could not get a ration card because I could not prove that I was a Czech citizen. I went on to Nakod, where I managed to buy some food with the money I earned. I was also lucky in that I was able to get safely across the border again with food intended for my relatives. Then for several months, I went to Czechoslovakia many times for food. This continued until March 13, 1946, when the Polish government organized transport for Germans living in our area to German territory. Those who were older or had children had to go to the area controlled by the Russians. There, children over 14 and women over 40 were sent to refugee camps. We decided that this option did not suit us. I didn't want us to be divided again. We gathered the few belongings we have left, and as a family, we crossed the border into Czechoslovakia. Several people joined us along the way, including 4 children. The final destination of our journey was Nachod. One of those in our group knew someone who could help us with shelter and food for a few days. Another woman in our group told us that she had a son-in-law living in Brana. After resting for a few days in Nutkad, we went deep into Czech territory to the town of Brana. That woman's son-in-law kindly allowed us to stay with him for a few days. He was a member of the Glacier Committee and the anti-fascist movement. The woman and her children decided to stay in Brno with her son-in-law, after which there were 6 people left in our group. She promised me to talk to her son-in-law about documents for me. This woman fulfilled her promise. Her son-in-law instructed one of his subordinates to take me to Prague, where I could get a repatriation permit for 500 crowns. Our money was barely enough to buy these documents. The trip and the transaction went well, and soon I was on my way back to Brno with the documents in my hands, which gave me the right to cross the Czechoslovakian border without hindrance. I sat silently in the car, stunned by the news that I was no longer an undocumented refugee. I was overcome with a sense of freedom. There were still many obstacles to overcome. My family was still homeless and hungry, and I had no means to support them. But I would no longer be hunted like game. I no longer had to fear any unfamiliar sight on the street. 5 years full of misadventure came to an end. There has been fighting, despair, hunger, but most of all deception. I am proud of what I was able to accomplish. I survived. Every day I had to fight to remain in the shadows, unrecognized. No one I met, not even those people from the NKVD, ever found out who I really was.